So I wrote a paper for one of my philosophy classes. I'm just calling it my personal philosophy of the argument. It was supposed to be something about argument and some kind of chapter summary thing. It sounded pretty boring to me, so I just sort of went off on my own tangent. You can't really talk about argument intelligently and have a conversation about it, or even an intelligent argument, unless you're sort of defining the context in which the argument is happening. So, again, like all things, I can't really approach this subject without first outlining my whole worldview paradigm of how all this stuff works in the first place, and then perhaps we can have an intelligent conversation about argument and philosophy. And if you're wondering why I'm not wearing a shirt, it's 78 degrees in here. Why would I be wearing a shirt? Anyways, I also noticed most people don't like to read. So I'm just going to make a video of me reading my essay, because I know if I post it online, no one's going to freaking read it. But here's a video of me reading it, and someone might actually hear my ideas this way. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I spent decades of my life trying to do this. Seems like a relatively fruitless endeavor compared to other ways of spending time and energy. All I'm trying to do here is to share my personal perspective on things in a way that's entertaining enough and easy enough to read and understand that it might actually be read and understood, unlike the work of many great thinkers in times past. What's my objective? It's my own entertainment, and perhaps yours if you like a dash of intellect with your amusement. I'll work my way down to what arguing is, which is supposed to be the purpose of this paper, but first I need to start with the context, which is defining it. Context is everything. It's what defines things. I'll start from the top with the biggest single thing we can imagine and possibly comprehend. Let's call it the universe, God, infinite intelligence, a unified field. Pick one. Part of the dualistic perspective we're locked into as human beings involves seeing things as one or the other. It's very hard for us to see both at the same time. For example, good and evil, right and wrong, life and death. This is what dualism is. How can something be true and false at the same time? It's not possible if you're a materialist or any kind of being whose thought is bound by logic and reason. You're in a box. Logic and reason are observable patterns happening within one bigger thing that itself is not logical or reasonable. The material manifestation of the intelligence has all sorts of logical and observable patterns, but the underlying, which it is coming from, is not bound by these limitations. Call the underlying consciousness or mind or God. Now, I can't prove that it was here first, before the material world, and the materialists can't prove that the material was here first and then created consciousness. But it's fun to watch people try, to hear their ideas, and more importantly, come to understand people and how they think. What most people call thinking, to me, looks more like logicking, if that's a word. It's sort of following this chain of, okay, well, if this, then that, and if we take this thing and that thing, then it means this. But we can't even prove the laws of cause and effect in the first place, so it's an interesting practice. You're quite reflective of the underlying intelligence in the universe. So trying to use reason and logic to understand what reality is and how it works is sort of like trying to use reason and logic to understand what a human mind is and how it works. There are certainly many observable patterns that are perfectly logical, but there aren't many of us who live like Spock, a logical being who doesn't experience or comprehend human emotion. Your emotions make you do all sorts of shit that doesn't make any logical sense. Not in the moment, not even in hindsight. If you're still trying to understand reality, which includes you and your emotions, you're trying to do this through the use of logic, your roadblocks will be many until someone helps you along with a scientific revolution or a spiritual awakening. There needs to be a huge paradigm shift in order to get past those roadblocks. So here's where I'll make an arbitrary split in reality to create my own slices of dualism, because how else could we even talk about this? There's only one thing here as far as I can tell. I can't prove it, and you can't prove otherwise. All we can do is talk about it, using some self-referencing symbols and sort of a mental masturbation. So grab some lotion and let's begin. In the same way we might split the world and say, these things are good and these things are bad, I'll split the world and say, these things are masculine and these things are feminine. I'll describe chaos, lack of order, lack of direction as feminine energy, which is not nearly as insulting as it sounds. I'm building up to something here. Feminine energy is that which unifies, connects, and holds together. We can even think of it as affinity or love. It's an energy of connection with no egoistic concerns. I'll describe the will to power, the will to control or dominate nature, one's environment, as a masculine energy. This can also be thought of as an egoistic survival tendency that all living things have. As soon as you put yourself first and decide, I'm going to eat that plant or that animal, it will die so that I can live, or I'll manipulate it and use it to feed myself, or this situation to ensure my survival. Once you do that, you're using your will to manipulate nature, your surroundings, your environment towards your survival, which you probably view as beneficial from your limited perspective. But the food will not crawl or grow into your belly without will or effort. This is where your perspective and sense of self comes from. It comes from the arbitrary boundary that you draw between yourself and your environment, the creation of self and other, entirely in your mind. Some people would gladly forego food and die if their children were starving. Their boundary of self is outside of their physical body. The notion of, I'll take from the environment so that my self or my body can survive, is ego in full swing. I'm not saying that ego is good or bad. I'm saying that it's a limited perspective without which none of this world would be possible. It would just be one big interconnected soup incapable of even looking at itself. We need to mentally fabricate the idea of being separate from the soup in order to observe it. So what the heck does all this have to do with arguing? Arguing is just the masculine playing itself out. It is that which seeks to control and bring order to the interconnected, unordered chaos soup of the feminine. Keep in mind, it only appears chaotic when an ego forms and can't see the whole picture and how everything is interconnected. A bold statement, I know. And here I am in a class where I'm supposed to be making arguments before my conclusions, as if logic will somehow lead your mind to the same conclusion as me. It won't. You'd have to be out of your mind to believe the shit that I do without experiencing it for yourself first. One reason human beings argue is to iron out their ideas and ways of thinking so that they grow in understanding and potential power. With more understanding and better ideas comes more potential for survival and happiness, which is a good thing from our perspective. But isn't it possible that from a bigger perspective, like that of the Earth, that survival of humans is more of a neutral thing? Or perhaps not such a good thing at all? To say that it's good for humans to survive and thrive is, well, the epitome of anthropocentrism and fueled by egoism. Again, I'm not saying whether all of this is good or bad. I'm just pointing out noteworthy things that stand out to me. Another reason people argue is to convince others that their way of thinking is correct or better. This is the ego wanting to observe and participate in its own idea of what progress is. This is will, or power, growing organically so that it may be able to affect the world even more and turn the world into even more of a habitat for ego and survival. So I see a lot of people using philosophical reasoning and deduction to observe even more patterns in the universe and human thought and human will and desire. I don't think these patterns can answer any of life's biggest questions, but they do serve to engage the mind in reflecting on life's biggest mysteries. If we tease the mind and create a hunger for answers, for more understanding and more knowledge, pretty soon the mind just might do the one thing it needs to do in order to understand the secrets of the universe, which is to let go of all previously conceived beliefs. If you believe reality is one thing and not the other thing, this causes a conflict and limits reality. I don't know how it is for you in your experience, but reality sure looks to be unlimited from my perspective. Perhaps it's just your one slice of reality that's limited. Perhaps it's only your beliefs that are preventing you from seeing this. Want to argue about it?